Okay, so picture this, the U.S. in 1917, April 1917, and for almost 3 years, right, this catastrophic war has been raging across the Atlantic, and America's like stayed out of it, well, officially at least. But then all of a sudden, everything changes. The U.S. declares war on Germany. It's
Wow.
like a huge turning point, right? A hinge point in history, wouldn't you say?
Oh, absolutely.
So today on the deep dive, we're diving deep into the reasons, the key factors that brought America into World War I.
Okay.
You gave us a great historical overview, and what we want to do is kind of extract those core reasons behind this huge decision to give you a clear, insightful understanding of this really important moment in history.
Absolutely. It was not a snap decision. I think that's one of the things that's so fascinating about this particular period is it really was an evolution
Yeah.
of events and circumstances that kind of led almost inexorably to American intervention. And I think it's a powerful illustration of how even a nation that is determined to remain neutral can ultimately be drawn into a global conflict.
Okay, so let's rewind the clock back to August 1914 when the war first breaks out in Europe.
Hmm.
What was President Wilson's initial stance?
So Wilson's immediate response, articulated on August 4th, 1914, was a firm declaration of neutrality.
Right.
He famously called on Americans to be neutral in fact, as well as in name during these days that are to try men's souls. And this wasn't simply a political statement. It reflected a deeply held desire to keep America out of the European entanglement.
And what was driving that? Was it just like, we don't want to get involved, or were there other factors at play?
So there were several key factors that underpinned this stance. Firstly, there wasn't a widely perceived direct threat to American interests. The conflict was seen by many as essentially a European affair.
Right.
Geographically distant, not immediately impacting American security, or so it was thought.
Yeah.
The second point is that the United States, of course, was a nation of immigrants,
Right.
with large populations tracing their roots to countries on both sides of this conflict. And Wilson was very acutely aware of the potential for the war to ignite deep and damaging divisions within American society.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Maintaining neutrality was seen as absolutely crucial for domestic unity.
Yeah, like trying to keep the peace at home when everything's falling apart overseas.
Exactly. And so the key insight here, I think, is that this initial neutrality wasn't just about foreign policy. It was deeply intertwined with the fabric of American identity and social cohesion at the time.
Right, but even with this official neutrality, I mean, our sources point out that American companies continued to trade. How did that work in practice?
American companies did continue to engage in international trade, supplying a range of goods, including food, raw materials, and even some munitions to both the Allied and Central Powers.
Oh, wow. So they were supplying both sides.
They were supplying both sides, however, and this is a critical nuance.
Okay.
The British Royal Navy had established a very effective naval blockade of Germany. This blockade severely restricted the flow of goods to the Central Powers. So while the official policy may have suggested open trade with all belligerents, the reality was that the vast majority of American exports ended up going to the Allied nations.
Right. So in practice, they were helping one side more than the other.
Yes. And furthermore, American banks also extended loans. And again, the overwhelming proportion of that financial support was directed towards the Allied cause. So the strategic importance of this British blockade cannot be overstated. It wasn't merely a trade disruption. It was a deliberate effort to cripple Germany's war effort by denying it crucial resources,
Okay.
effectively tilting the economic balance despite America's declared neutrality.
So it was almost like neutrality in name only, right? Because they were definitely economically supporting one side.
Absolutely.
Let's move on to 1915 and the sinking of the Lusitania. This feels like a major crack in that neutral stance.
Absolutely. The sinking of the British ocean liner Lusitania by a German U-boat on May 7th, 1915 was a pivotal moment in this evolution. The sheer scale of the tragedy, nearly 1,200 lives lost, including 128 Americans, sent shockwaves across American society.
Right.
This wasn't some distant battle. This was American civilians among the casualties.
Yeah.
It dramatically strained diplomatic relations with Germany, and it really began to erode public support for neutrality. So the Lusitania sinking wasn't just a tragic loss of life. It fundamentally shifted the perception of the European war from a distant conflict to a direct threat to American lives.
And how did President Wilson respond? I mean, obviously there must have been a huge public outcry. Did he feel the pressure to maybe consider joining the war?
He did. He issued a very strong demand that Germany cease its practice of unannounced submarine warfare,
Okay.
emphasizing the violation of international law, the loss of innocent lives.
Right.
However, despite immense public pressure, despite increasing calls for a more forceful response, Wilson remained hesitant to commit the United States to military intervention at this stage.
So he was still trying to hold on to that
He
neutrality.
was clinging to the hope of maintaining neutrality.
Okay. And finding a diplomatic resolution, his calculation was that entering the war would have profound and potentially negative consequences for the nation.
But not everyone felt that way, right?
Absolutely not.
Our sources mention Theodore Roosevelt, the former president. He was
Wow.
pretty outspoken, wasn't he? Former President Theodore Roosevelt was a very vocal and influential critic of Wilson's non-interventionist policy.
Right.
He argued vehemently that the United States needed to be militarily prepared for potential involvement in the war,
Okay.
and actively championed what became known as the preparedness movement.
And what was that all about?
So the preparedness movement was a push for significant investment in the U.S. military
Okay.
to ensure national security in an increasingly unstable global environment. Roosevelt and his supporters believed that America's weakness was actually emboldening Germany.
Okay, so they were saying we need to beef up our defenses just in case.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And the shock and outrage following the Lusitania disaster amplified the voices of those who had been warning about the need for military readiness. And the preparedness movement gained a lot of traction in this new climate of fear and uncertainty.
Right. And so then we get to 1916, a presidential election year. And Wilson runs successfully on the slogan, "He kept us out of war and America first."
Right.
So that really shows how much people didn't want to get involved in this European mess, right?
Yes, his re-election in November 1916 on those very slogans clearly indicated that a significant portion of the American public still favored staying out of the European conflict.
Right.
However, and I think this is really fascinating to juxtapose this strong desire for peace with growing concerns about the actual state of the U.S. military.
Yeah, totally.
Our sources highlight the deployment of American troops to Mexico to pursue Pancho Villa,
Right.
and how this expedition really exposed significant shortcomings in the Army's readiness organization and equipment.
Right.
This raised serious questions about America's ability to defend itself if drawn into a larger conflict.
So even while campaigning on a platform of keeping America out of the war, there was this understanding that they might need to get more ready.
Right, it's like a parallel track.
Yeah, what concrete steps did they take during this time to get more prepared?
So in response to these growing concerns about military readiness, Wilson signed two significant pieces of legislation in 1916.
Okay.
The National Defense Act, passed in June, authorized a substantial expansion of the Army from roughly 90,000 to over 175,000 personnel, and a significant increase in the National Guard.
Okay.
Then in August, further legislation was passed with the aim of dramatically strengthening the U.S. Navy through a major shipbuilding program.
Okay, so they were taking some pretty serious steps to get ready, even while saying they wanted to stay out of it.
It suggests that the administration recognized the increasing instability in the world and the potential for the U.S. to be drawn in, regardless of public sentiment at that moment.
Let's move into 1917, January 1917. Things seem to take a very sharp turn with Germany's decision regarding submarine warfare. What did they announce?
So on January 31st, 1917, the German government made a fateful and ultimately disastrous decision. They announced the resumption of unrestricted submarine warfare.
Oh, wow.
Effectively reversing their earlier Sussex pledge, this meant that German U-boats would now target all ships, including neutral vessels in the waters around Great Britain and France, without warning.
So basically open season on anyone.
Their calculation, and it was a desperate gamble, was that by crippling Allied supply lines, they could force a swift victory before the United States could effectively mobilize its resources and intervene in the war.
So they were willing to risk bringing America into the war because they thought they could win before America could do anything about it.
Exactly. It was a very high-stakes gamble.
And how did the U.S. react to this, basically ignoring international law and earlier Sussex pledge?
The immediate reaction was one of outrage and a significant step away from neutrality. On February 3rd, the U.S. severed diplomatic ties with Germany.
Wow.
This was a clear signal of America's deep displeasure and a strong condemnation of Germany's actions, and then, tragically, in February and March of 1917, German U-boats began sinking American merchant ships.
So not just any ships, American ships.
These weren't just foreign vessels. They were American-owned and operated, carrying American citizens, and these attacks resulted in American casualties.
So this is getting very real for the U.S., right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
This brought the reality of the war directly and brutally home in a way that even the Lusitania sinking hadn't.
Right, because now they're directly attacking American interests.
Direct attacks on American interests and American lives.
And on top of all that, we have the infamous Zimmerman telegram Can you explain what that was for anyone who might not know?
Absolutely. So the Zimmermann telegram was a secret communication sent in January 1917 by the German Foreign Minister Arthur Zimmermann to the German minister in Mexico, Heinrich von Eckhardt.
Okay.
British intelligence intercepted this encrypted message and, through remarkable code-breaking efforts, managed to decipher it.
Wow.
The telegram contained a proposal for a military alliance between Germany and Mexico. And the key condition was that if the United States were to enter the war on the side of the Allies, Germany offered to provide significant financial support to Mexico to help it reclaim territories lost to the United States in the Mexican-American War, specifically the states of Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona.
Wow, so like redrawing the map of America.
Yes, and furthermore, the telegram suggested that Mexico should also try to encourage Japan to join the Central Powers, thus creating a significant strategic challenge for the United States in its own hemisphere.
Wow, so Germany's trying to stir up trouble on America's doorstep.
This was a direct and audacious attempt by Germany to incite aggression against the United States on its own borders.
So how did this bombshell telegram come to light?
The British, having successfully deciphered the Zimmermann telegram, recognized its immense significance and its potential to really turn American public opinion in favor of war.
Yeah.
So they shared this information with President Wilson.
Okay.
On February 24th, 1917, Wilson understandably was initially skeptical and sought to verify the authenticity of the telegram. But once its legitimacy was confirmed, the Wilson administration made the calculated decision to release the contents to the American press.
Yeah.
This public disclosure occurred on March 1st, 1917, and the impact was immediate and profound.
Yeah, I can only imagine.
The American public was outraged by what was perceived as a treacherous and hostile act by Germany, revealing a clear intent to undermine American sovereignty and incite war on American soil.
So this telegram was really the nail in the coffin for neutrality, wasn't it?
Absolutely. It was the final straw. While the resumption of unrestricted submarine warfare directly threatened American lives, commerce, and neutral rights on the seas, the Zimmermann telegram was viewed as a direct and audacious threat to the security and territorial integrity of the United States itself. It galvanized public opinion against Germany to an unprecedented degree and effectively silenced most of the remaining voices advocating for continued neutrality.
Okay, so with all of this going on, German aggression, public outrage, President Wilson finally goes before Congress in April 1917. What did he say, and how did Congress respond?
So on April 2nd, 1917, President Wilson delivered a powerful and historic address to a special joint session of Congress.
Right.
He solemnly requested a declaration of war against the Imperial German government in his speech. He famously articulated the moral imperative for intervention, stating that the world must be made safe for democracy.
Right.
He framed the decision to go to war not merely as a matter of national self-interest, but as a noble cause to defend democratic values and international order against autocratic aggression.
And Congress overwhelmingly supported this, right?
The shift in congressional sentiment was dramatic and decisive on April 4th. The Senate voted overwhelmingly in favor of the war resolution, 82 senators voting yes and only 6 dissenting.
Wow.
2 days later, on April 6th, the House of Representatives followed suit, passing the war resolution by a vote of 373 to 50.
Okay.
And it's significant to note that one of the dissenting votes in the House was cast by Jeanette Rankin of Montana, the first woman elected to Congress, highlighting that even at this late hour, there were still principled voices arguing against intervention. And it's also worth remembering that this was only the 4th time in American history that Congress had formally declared war.
And the U.S. military at that time was still pretty small and unprepared for a large-scale European war, wasn't it?
That's correct. In early 1917, the United States Army was relatively small, with a standing force of around 133,000 personnel, recognizing the urgent need for a much larger fighting force to effectively contribute to the Allied war effort. Congress quickly passed the Selective Service Act in May 1917.
Right, the draft.
This act reinstated the draft for the first time since the Civil War, marking a significant shift in American military policy.
And it was a big shift, wasn't it?
By the end of the war, in November 1918, approximately 2.8 million American men had been inducted into the military through the draft, with another roughly 2 million volunteering for service. Ultimately, over 2 million U.S. troops served on the Western Front in Europe, and tragically, more than 50,000 of them made the ultimate sacrifice, losing their lives in the conflict. It's also important to note that the United States later declared war on Austria-Hungary in December 1917, but never formally declared war on the Ottoman Empire or Bulgaria, even though these were also part of the Central Powers.
So, just to sum up, we've gone from this initial strong stance of neutrality to the sinking of the Lusitania, which started to change public opinion.
Yeah.
Then, even though Wilson was reelected on an anti-war platform, there was this growing anxiety about the preparedness of the U.S. military.
Right.
But the real turning point seems to be when Germany resumes unrestricted submarine warfare, directly targeting American lives and commerce, and then the shocking revelation of the Zimmermann telegram, which showed hostile intentions towards U.S. territory.
Precisely. It wasn't a single dramatic event in isolation, but rather this cascading series of interconnected factors that progressively dismantled America's initial commitment to neutrality and ultimately propelled the nation into the global conflict of World War I. Each of these elements, the violation of American neutral rights on the seas, the escalating threat to national security and territorial integrity, and the significant shift in American public sentiment fueled by these events, played a critical and indispensable role in that momentous decision.
It's amazing how all of these things came together to change the course of history.
It's a powerful illustration of how seemingly isolated events can have far-reaching and often unforeseen consequences.
This has been an incredible deep dive into this really pivotal moment in American history.
Absolutely.
It shows how complex the decision for a nation to go to war is, all the different things that are involved, domestic concerns, economic interest, public opinion, and external threats. It's not a simple decision.
Indeed. And reflecting on these events, I think it leads to a really thought-provoking question for you, our listener. Considering this intricate web of factors that led to U.S. entry into World War I, what might the course of history have looked like if even just one of these key elements, for instance, the sinking of the Lusitania not resulting in American deaths or the Zimmermann telegram never being intercepted, had unfolded differently?
Yeah, that's interesting.
Or, on a broader level, how does this detailed understanding of the path to U.S. involvement in World War I inform our analysis of similar historical junctures, where nations grapple with this profound decision of whether or not to engage in foreign conflicts?
Food for thought.
It certainly gives us much to contemplate.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into America's entry into World War I.
It's been my pleasure.
Until next time.